Today we've got a crazy story of a lecturer intentionally giving a failing grade and the revenge story of getting them fired. We'll get into that in a bit, but first, don't term me an animal hater next time. More often than not, people tend to tell you that older people are the best angels in human form. Well, I call BS. You see, the thing with older folks is that when they want to be sweet, they can be insanely sweet. And at other times, they can hurt way worse than a sore you get from breaking into new shoes. You know, those ankle sores that are very uncomfortable, but no one expects the shoes to give you discomfort because they're neat and new on the outside. This is the way I would describe older people. They have this tendency to be stereotyped to be nice and sweet and can't do much harm. Well, it's a lie, and all it took for me to come to this conclusion was an unfounded slander. I'm kind of a quiet person. No, not the kind that didn't interact with other people in the neighborhood or town. I was just the kind of person who did not care to bother people if they didn't come to me first. This is why I liked the town I lived in. It was quiet, and the people there were a bit friendly, nothing too extra. I had a couple of neighbors I knew on a first-name basis, and some that I did not bother too much about. One of the latter was Mrs. Jenkins. She was elderly. I think she was a government worker for most of her life, and decided to live the rest of her life following her retirement and the death of her husband in the quiet town. I know for certain that people tended to hold to her words. She was like those elderly people that people came to for advice just because. She appeared to live a serene life behind the wooden stockade fence that bordered her property. Our paths had never crossed, not more than seeing her from inside of my house, and I had no reason to suspect that Mrs. Jenkins harbored any ill will towards me. The entire neighborhood always seemed a bit weird to me. Everything looked neat and pretty, like a picture in a magazine. It was low-key weird. Houses had nice gardens with colorful flowers and bushes that were trimmed just right. Big fences separated each yard, making sure everyone had their own space, but still felt like part of the same neighborhood. Some fences were tall and made of wood, like the one around Mrs. Jenkins' house. Others were less cliché-like and were just boring, just like the people who resided in the houses. It was why I could fit into their routine. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there. It was business as usual. At best, kids got into trouble for being kids. Then it was not, and this was all because of Mrs. Jenkins, the old, harmless, retired public servant. She was the one that tainted the sanity of the neighborhood, unlike most people initially believed. All I did was strike back. One day, out of nowhere, Mrs. Jenkins said something that made my heart stop. She accused me of trying to hurt her dog. Can you believe it? Me hurting an innocent animal? It just didn't make sense. And no, I did not hear of the accusation directly from her. I heard it in passing when I was out to get groceries. They didn't intend to let me in the conversation since I just happened to overhear them saying something about Mrs. Jenkins' dog and how her neighbor had a hand in why it was injured. Yes, it could have been the other neighbor on the other side, but that neighbor was a he. The referenced guilty neighbor was a she. That is, it was me. I couldn't understand why she would say such a thing. I had never had any pets of my own simply because I could not be bothered to keep up with taking care of them, but that didn't mean that I hated animals of any kind. I've always been kind to animals and I would never do anything to hurt them. But there she was, pointing her finger at me and saying I was the one who tried to harm her furry friend. For the first time since I moved into the house, I decided to see her face to face. It was just to ask her why I heard that she was accusing me of doing something to her dog when I'd never even walked up to her for any reason since I moved in. Right? Right. But it turned out to be something I was not expecting. Not for someone who had the kind of reputation that she did among people in the neighborhood. I tried to tell her it wasn't true, that she must have misunderstood something, but she wouldn't listen. She was so sure it was me. It felt like a punch in the gut. How could someone I've never even talked to accuse me of something so awful? I felt lost and confused. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood was whispering about me, looking at me like I was some kind of monster. This was exactly what I was avoiding that made me leave the city. I was suddenly tired of the drama that came with being involved with the hustle of city life and decided to move into my late grandfather's home. But it appeared that the drama followed me everywhere, and no matter where I chose to lay my head, my name would make it into one controversy or the other. That day when I rang the bell to the house, it took ages for her to get to the door. Arguably, she's elderly. I took no offense. I introduced myself to her since that was the first time we would actually be engaging in any conversation. I then tried to explain to her as calmly as I could that I'd overheard some person at the store talking about an incident I knew nothing about. However, just before I could say anything, she accused me of pretending to be shocked while knowing the full details of what I did. She gave me no room to talk, as elderly people are fond of, and stormed off back to whatever she was doing before I came around. As I tried to wrap my head around Mrs. Jenkins' accusation, something unexpected happened. Rumors started flying around the neighborhood like leaves in a storm. People were saying all sorts of things about me, things that weren't true at all. They said I hated animals, that I was some kind of monster who wanted to hurt innocent creatures. It was like a nightmare come to life. I couldn't believe how quickly people were ready to believe such awful things about me, and I genuinely think that this was what they thought of me. I mean, it was Mrs. Jenkins. No one would expect that she was in the wrong. I had to be the bad guy. But more than telling people that I was the one who orchestrated the attack on her dog, she started using this accusation to solicit funds for the vet bill of the dog. Before I knew it, there was a fundraiser going on with people donating money left and right to help Mrs. Jenkins cover the vet bills. But here's the thing, I had no idea of any of this happening. I was completely in the dark, going about my days as if everything was normal, putting the whole ordeal behind me. So how did I find out? That evening, like every other evening, I was enjoying the solitude I'd grown to like when I heard my phone ringing. I didn't intend to pick up because I didn't want to ruin the silence, but when I saw that it was my mom, I was forced to pick it up before it went to voicemail. After the initial facade of asking how I was doing, she went into the real reason why she called. She asked what type of trouble I was mixed up with, hinting at the fact that I left the city because I wanted to ease off the drama. At first, I was confused. From my end, I had pushed the whole Mrs. Jenkins scenario off of my mind and it was done with. There was nothing else that could have warranted her call. But apparently, Mrs. Jenkins was not done with me. I tried to explain to her, but she was prepared to take the words her police friend told her while they did their routine gossip about how I'm faring, then believe whatever I had to say. It was from her that I found out that Mrs. Jenkins was conducting an online fundraiser for the care of the dog. It was one thing to spread crappy stories about me in the community, but it was another thing to take it online and make me out to be the bad guy for a couple of $100s. I could live with the former, but not the latter, especially not when the story was untrue. To me, it was extortion. Extortion of my image and of public funds. So, I decided to set the record straight. The feeling that plagued me throughout this time was one of anger and betrayal. I felt angry because I just wanted to live in peace without the stress of dealing with other people's drama. And I felt frustrated because things did not seem to go in my plan at all. I knew I had to take action, but what could I do? I wasn't sure where to start. I thought about talking to the neighbors, but would they even listen to me? Mrs. Jenkins had already poisoned their minds against me, and there was no way they would want to take my word for it, especially not over hers. It was a tense dilemma. Then I remembered something my mom used to say, the truth always comes out in the end. Maybe she was right. Maybe if I could prove Mrs. Jenkins was lying, people would get off my back. But how could I prove it? I didn't have any evidence. All I had was my word against hers. It felt like a hopeless situation. Then I remembered the conversation I overheard at the store. They said Mrs. Jenkins' dog was injured in her yard. But if that was true, there should be evidence, right? Maybe I could find something to prove she was lying. So I decided to go to the very place where she claimed I injured her dog. Her story was that she saw a shadow lurking from my side of the fence. After the strange sighting, she noticed that her dog had been injured, and since I was the only one occupying the place, it could only be my handiwork. I started by looking around her yard, searching for any signs of the incident, and just before I threw in the towel, I saw it. A patch of torn fabric caught on the edge of the fence. My heart raced as I carefully examined the fabric. It was torn and stained with blood, just like Mrs. Jenkins said. But something didn't add up. The fabric was on the inside of the fence, not the outside. That was when it hit me. Mrs. Jenkins had been lying this whole time. Her dog wasn't hurt by some mysterious attacker. It was hurt in her own yard. With what I discovered, I knew I couldn't waste time. I took a picture of the torn fabric and rushed home to share my discovery with the neighborhood. I posted the picture on social media as a comment to her fundraiser post, along with a detailed account of what I'd found. Within minutes, the post started gaining traction. People were shocked by the revelation and began questioning Mrs. Jenkins' integrity. People started asking questions, and soon enough, the whole thing fell apart. So I'm kind of assuming this whole thing kind of went down on like a Facebook group or like a Nextdoor type thing. That said, if you were one of the people that did get suckered into paying for this dog's vet bills, even if you found out that this person was lying about blaming another person, would you still be feeling like you want your money back even though it did still go towards helping the dog? And a lying elderly person, but still an elderly person's dog nonetheless? I'd be curious what you guys think. Also, hi, I'm Steven, and if you guys enjoy crazy stories of revenge, it would be amazing if you left a like or left a review if you're listening to my podcast. That said, our next story is Revenging on the School Management. My dad is usually a nice guy, and to be honest, prior to this vengeful act of his, I would never have expected or believed that he could do something like this. And in a way, I still laugh at how upset he must have been to decide to make a revenge play at people. When we were still kids, my younger sister and I used to live in this neighborhood that had a school close by. The school was really close by and just opposite of the house we lived in then. We didn't attend there because Mom was never cool with the fact that the school was so close to home. For some weird reason, only she understood, she wanted us to school more than 20 minutes drive away from home. So we didn't go to this particular school. Every morning was war. Every single morning that students had to come into the property. I knew the routine like the back of my hand. It started with car horns blaring as parents dropped off their children, blocking our driveway and nearly causing accidents as we attempted to navigate our way out onto the busy street. Yes, there were times when one supposedly smart parent would drive and stop by the side of our property just as Mom or Dad were about to pull out from the driveway. I could not say about Mom, but I knew it drove Dad crazy. And as if that weren't enough, the students themselves added to the complete insanity with their careless littering, treating our neighborhood like their personal dumping ground. They just never seemed to care that they were desecrating other people's property. My dad was particularly vocal about it. He would often shake his head in frustration as he watched yet another student toss a candy wrapper or a cigarette butt onto the pavement. And the wind, always their accomplice to their silly attitudes, would carry it into our driveway and those of our neighbors. Despite his numerous complaints to the school's headmaster, nothing seemed to change. It was as if our concerns fell on deaf ears. It was either that or they didn't see anything wrong with the actions, or they just felt that my dad's complaints were too much. My mom would grumble under her breath as she picked up the stray pieces of trash that found their way onto our lawn, while my younger sister would watch with wide eyes wondering what exactly was going on. Mom did not feel right about confronting the school management, so she just tried to adapt, but my dad did not. I remember the day he folded. He was speaking to Mom on the lawn, complaining about how dirty the compound has remained and how the whole street is beginning to look like animals stayed within the house on the street because of the trash coming from the school. While my mom was of the opinion that there was nothing we could do about the whole street being dirty if the school didn't stand up and act right, my dad thought differently. He decided that he couldn't just sit back and watch the litter problem get worse. He took it upon himself to do something about it. He came in, picked up his keys, and drove to the store. When he got back, we saw him with a handful of supplies that were more than we could use for a week's cleaning. He started cleaning up the mess left behind by the students. It wasn't just about our own driveway anymore. He ventured onto neighboring properties, collecting litter and disposing of it properly. It was kind of inspiring to see him take action like that. I was wondering how long he would be able to keep up the cleaning if he was the only one doing it, but he thought better than I did. He knew that to truly tackle the problem, he needed help. So he reached out to our neighbors, including Tom and Mark, and asked them to join him in his mission to clean up the neighborhood. Surprisingly, they were all too happy to lend a hand. This was when I knew that it was not just my family that had issues with the way the school was running the trash system. At the beginning of their work against the dirtiness that the students brought to the environment, it was just about cleaning and getting things back to the way they were. But there's something about kids. The more you try to make it seem wrong, the eager they are to keep at that act. I was a kid then. I could understand what was going through their minds more than my dad or his army of cleaning agents could. On some days when I felt up for it, I joined them to go around the block, picking trash around people's property. Some cared about the dirt and their surrounding was less tedious to clear out, but some did not, and it was on properties like this that I got more infuriated. No matter how hard we tried, the littering just wouldn't stop. It felt like we were fighting a losing battle. Every day, despite my dad's efforts and those of our neighbors, the streets remained cluttered with trash. It was kind of disheartening to see, and it seemed like no matter how many times we cleaned up, the students at the high school would just come along and make a mess again. As time went on, our frustration only grew. It wasn't just the litter itself that bothered us. It was the lack of respect shown by the students and the seeming indifference of the school administration. We felt like our concerns were falling on deaf ears as nobody cared about the impact their actions were having on our neighborhood, and of course, the insane-like parking of the parents and driving of the students did not. My dad in particular was deeply frustrated. He had put so much time, energy, money, and effort into trying to address the problem, only to see it persist. I could see the anger building up inside him, simmering just beneath the surface. He was determined to make a change, but it felt like the more he tried, the worse things got. You know when people see you put in so much effort but are determined to make your effort feel inconsequential? This was exactly the case between my dad, his cleaning friends, and the school management in connection with the students of the school. The constant littering took a toll on all of us, especially my dad. It made our neighborhood look run down and neglected, and it made him feel powerless to do anything about it. The last time I ever saw him look that powerless was when Mom was rushed to the hospital a couple of years ago following an accident on her way to work. Seeing him feel this helpless was a new kind of low. After weeks of frustration and feeling like we were hitting our heads against a brick wall, we decided enough was enough. He was tired of waiting for the school to take action. So, he took matters into his own hands. He decided that it was time to stick it to the school management themselves. He was of the opinion that if they acted right, the students would too. I agreed with him. I told him what I thought would work, and surprisingly, he agreed to it. He settled on a time when the school would be empty, late on a Sunday night when everyone would be at home getting ready for the week ahead. My dad took charge like a general leading his troops into battle. He called Tom and Mark and told them of his plan. Well, my plan, but you get the gist. To join him in our mission to make a statement to the school administration. We continued to pick up the litter left by the students day after day, knowing that the time for payback was soon. We knew, but they didn't, so it made the work a bit more interesting than it had been all these weeks ago. He told us what we needed to do: collect the litter left behind by the students and pack it into bags. We worked quickly and quietly, our hands moving with purpose as we gathered up the trash spread across our neighborhood for far too long. This time, we went beyond the places we used to clean up. Once we had filled the bags, we hid them at the back of our house, ready to be transported to the school when the time was right. We did this for over a week. From the evening of Thursday to the next Saturday, when my dad saw that the bags were a lot and they were beginning to smell, he told us it was time to move. But I was not allowed on the adventure. For some reason, which I got to understand when I got older, I could not be there. 1, Mom would have killed them if she caught wind of what they were planning to do, and 2, there was every possibility of things going wrong. It was fine for him to be caught, but it made no sense to put me in front of that kind of risk. Anyway, I stayed home and got the full gist of how it all went down when he got back from the operation. The day that was finally decided was the late hours of Sunday night. Almost into the morning of Monday, silently, they made our way to school. I believe that the hours they had spent picking the trash of the students was enough practice to teach them how to scatter the trash around in a way that it would be noticed by everyone who came into the premises. It was kind of easier to get into the school since they didn't have a fenced area or a security guard that patrolled on Sunday nights. They could never have thought that anyone would want to trash the school, would they? I thought that was the end of the revenge plan. Trash the school with the litter of the students spread across the neighborhood, but my dad and his guys had a better option in mind. They didn't stop there. When he got back, he explained to me that he felt the trash would not be enough to tell them why the school was vandalized. They went to the broadest clear wall they could find and inscribed a message to the students and the school management alike. From what I remember, the words they scribbled about 5 times across the school walls were about how they liked it being trashed and what they were going to do about it. After our revenge act, things got pretty crazy at the school. Everyone was talking about the littering and graffiti, and there was a lot of chaos and confusion. As they entered the school on Monday morning, the first thing they saw was the dirt and the message. There was no way they would have prevented the news from spreading out. Even though the school tried to figure out who did it, they couldn't find any clues to catch us. It felt like a win for my dad and all of us who had to pick up the trash the students left behind. But the good news was that the school finally started doing something about the littering problem, which in my opinion they should have done before things got out of hand. They put more bins around the campus and taught the students about keeping things clean. At long last, the neighborhood had a better face. More so, it got quieter. I love the idea that there is this group of guys that, for a long time, more so than just the week they went around collecting all this stuff, were out there collecting all this trash and litter and having bags full of stuff. And upon investigation, the school goes, "We can't figure out who these people are. Definitely not the people who live right off of the school right here that pick up all the trash." Now, having evidence that it's explicitly them, that's another thing, but it's pretty easy to assume who probably did it. Our next story is, lecturer gives me a failing grade, so I get him fired. The last time I checked the world statistics, I, 21-year-old female, realized that my country ranks among one of the top 20 most corrupt countries in the world. I saw that statistic, and I laughed. Seriously, I couldn't even be mad because I knew it was true. I was even surprised that it wasn't in the top 10. Every sector of the country has been taken over by people who don't care for anyone but themselves. People who only cared about money and power over others. Sometimes I wondered if things were so because we're all human and we all have flaws, but that didn't make any sense because there's a lot of other countries that aren't as corrupt as mine. I've heard stories from people who've gone through crazy experiences in the hands of corrupt people who abuse their power. But the first time I experienced this was in the university. I had just got in and was ready to begin my freshman year. The university was one of the most prestigious in my country, and I was only excited to be there, especially because I was there on scholarship. I hate to toot my own horn, but I possess way above average intelligence. I was a prodigy in academics, especially the sciences. I represented my high school countless times in many competitions, and I won many awards. Anyway, I just moved into my dorm and I met my new roommate, Sally, 23-year-old female. She had a few friends over and we all got acquainted. The first thing people notice about me is how beautiful I am. I can't say it isn't cool to get some pretty girl privileges once in a while, like having my meals paid for or cutting line at the club, but it takes as much as it gives. People see me and they see a girl that's all looks. Nobody even tries to engage my intellectual abilities. All I get from the guys are, "What's your skin routine?" or "What's your favorite color?" I thought this was the height of the problems that come with being attractive until my second day in class. My first day was good. I had a nice female lecturer who carried everyone along with her fun way of teaching. That day, I got to class early as usual and sat close to the front row ready to learn. The lecturer, let's call him Mr. H, 55-year-old male, walked in and introduced himself. He got right into the lecture and I listened with rapt attention. Halfway into the lecture, he glanced my way and stopped. I was surprised that he was staring at me, and I looked around to make sure it was really me he was staring at. Then he pointed at me and asked for my name. I told him and he asked me to wait until after the class. I didn't know what to expect. I mean, I've had my share of guys ogling me, but I didn't think that this would happen with lecturers. For God's sake, he was a lecturer, one who was twice my age. Anyway, I waited after the class ended and Mr. H walked up to me. He asked for my name and I told him. Then he said I was really pretty and that he was wondering if I'd like to have dinner with him sometime. I was a bit taken aback by this question. I couldn't decide which was more shocking, the fact that he asked me out to dinner or the fact that he did it out there in the open. Even though it was the end of the lecture, some other students were still hanging around, so they could see us talking. I didn't answer for a while and he had to call my attention again. I apologized and told him that his question caught me by surprise. I tried to remain calm and polite. I told him I was flattered by his proposal, but I couldn't accept it because I was a freshman and I had to focus on my schooling. Then he said he was trying to do me a favor by going out with me because he could help me make sure that I never failed any course. I found this very insulting because he was indirectly insinuating that I couldn't do it on my own. Still, I made sure to remain polite. I didn't want any problems with a lecturer. I told him I wasn't interested, but Mr. H wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He asked me to think about it and that he would expect an answer the next time he sees me, which was the next class. I got to my dorm and lay on my bed thinking about my predicament. Sally asked what my problem was. She was in her 3rd year and was more experienced than I was, so I told her, hoping she could give me some advice to help me get out of my problem. When I was done narrating what happened, Sally laughed. She said she knew something like that was going to happen to me, and she was waiting to see when it would. She said it had become totally normal in the school because the authorities weren't doing anything about it. She told me that once a lecturer sets his sights on a girl, they won't let go till they get what they want. Most times, the girls try to resist till the lecturer plays their hand. She even told me of a girl who had to transfer to another school because of a problem like that. I asked why they didn't try to report to the school authorities, and she said they did. But things like that don't work without proof, and since none of them could get proof, their claims were thrown out. At that point, I was even more confused. When I stepped into the dorm room, I wanted to call my older sister and tell her what was happening, but I knew what her response would be. She would tell me to leave the school, but I couldn't do that. This university was one of the best in the country, and I was there on scholarship. I wouldn't have been able to afford it anyway. After much thought, I decided to suck it up and tell him I wasn't interested. So, after our next class together, that was what I did. I walked up to him and told him I'd thought about his proposal, and I wasn't interested. He told me again that he was trying to help me because the exams would be tough, and he was just trying to give me an edge so I could pass. I couldn't take the insult anymore, so I told him I didn't need his help in passing any course. I'd made it there on my own. I'd gotten a scholarship on my own, and I would continue to pass on my own. I think my biggest mistake was telling him that I was there on a scholarship because after that, he smiled and backed off. I thought that was the end and that I was free until it was time for the mid-semester tests. I read as hard as I could and was confident that I'd get an A in the tests. I wrote the test and was even more confident in my A than before. But when the test results came in, I received the shock of my life. I got an F. I couldn't believe it. I had never gotten an F before in my entire life. The closest I've been to failing a course was getting a C, and even that was on rare occasions. I couldn't accept it because I knew what I'd written. There was no way I could score an F, so I decided to make a complaint. I went to Mr. H's office and told him there had been some kind of mistake in my test results. The smug look on his face told me everything I needed to know. There wasn't any mistake. He failed me intentionally. He said that was one of the reasons why he was asking me to date him, so he could help me when I didn't do well in class. I was so furious when he said this because he made it seem like I was incapable of passing on my own, which was absurd. I requested to see my paper so I could go through it, and he refused. He said he'd already submitted the entire thing to the head of the department and I couldn't get it back. I knew I could prove that he failed me intentionally if I could find my test paper, so I went back to my dorm and asked Sally for help. She was very reluctant at first because my plan to retrieve my test paper was dangerous and it could get both of us in big trouble. But after much convincing, she agreed to help. The next week, we waited for Mr. H to leave his office. He was teaching my class and the course was supposed to run for 2 hours. Then we went to his office and I picked up his lock and got in. Sally stayed on the lookout while I went in and searched his entire office for my answer sheet. It took me over an hour of combing through his files before I found it. It was completely unmarked. All he did was write a big X over the paper and put an F at the top right corner. He didn't even look at the answers, which proved my point of him giving me a bad score because I refused him. We left the office with the answer sheet and returned to the dorm to plan our next course of action. I couldn't confront Mr. H with the answer sheet, and I couldn't take it to the disciplinary committee without more evidence of his harassment, so I decided to get evidence. I got a spy camera. You know, the tiny ones people put on the buttons of their clothes? I attached it to my blouse and connected it to my phone. Then, I went to Mr. H's office. After he let me in, I accused him of switching my result because he wanted me to date him. He stupidly confessed to it because he didn't realize that I was filming him. Then he told me that he would continue to fail me no matter how well I did his course, till I gave him what he wanted. I asked him what that was, and he said he wanted me to be his. He didn't stop there. He even said there was nothing I could do because he always got what he wanted, and if I failed this course, I'd lose my scholarship. I left his office crying, an act for the camera, of course. By then, I'd had everything I needed, so I reported the case to the disciplinary committee and submitted a copy of the evidence. I added that if my case wasn't justly handled, I was going to sue the lecturer for sexual harassment and the school for negligence. A few days later, I was invited over to the Senate building where Mr. H was also present. He told them the answer sheet I submitted was not mine, and then he submitted a fake one where he marked and graded it F. I argued that it wasn't mine, and I gave them my past notes to compare the handwriting. They concluded that he was lying, and when they played the video in front of him, all color drained from his face, and he confessed that he asked me out. He begged the disciplinary board for leniency since it was the first time it happened, but somebody pointed out that it wasn't. Other girls had reported him over the years, but they never had evidence to support their claims. They fired him on the spot and offered me an apology. They also overturned my test grade to the A I deserved. Once somebody went out of their way to make sure that they recorded concrete evidence of this going on, I'm sure that school, while they were fine with the hushed whispers or rumors of corruption and whatnot, they probably didn't want to be attached to something that actually would have been a very pretty much slam dunk court case. But with that being said, that's all the time we have for today. Now, if you want to hear another absolutely crazy revenge story, check out that video on the left. Or if you missed my latest video, check out that video on the right. That said, I'll see you all next time with some more stories.